Hi, welcome to episode 7 of A Bible Primer. My name is Doug. We've already gone over the pre-Diluvian era, and we've gone over the patriarchal era, and that covers about 2,000 years of history, and we finished the book of Genesis in doing that. So now things are going to pick up just a little bit here. When we left the patriarchal era, Israel and his sons and his family unit had moved into Egypt. They were about 70 people in all, and they were a very honored, highly honored family unit that went in there. They, because Joseph, one of the brothers, was in there, and he was high up in the Egyptian government. So they spend about 400 years in Egypt, and a lot can happen in 400 years. If you think about 400 years before now, what was going on, Shakespeare was writing his plays, Florida was owned by Spain, and a lot's happened in the last 400 years. Well, a lot happened in the 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. Two things that are kind of important, I think. Number one is they went in as a family unit of about 70 people. 400 years later, they're a people group of over 1 million people. Some scholars estimate they might even have been as much as 2 million people. And the second thing is they went in as a very highly honored, very respected family. Now they're slaves. There's over 1 million slaves in this people group. So things have changed. Now it's into this scene that Moses comes into the scene. And Moses goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh, let my people go. And you are probably familiar with some of the stories still in Exodus. We're reading about the 10 plagues in Egypt, where the Nile turns to blood, and the plague of frogs, and plague of flies and gnats and hail and darkness. And the last plague in that is the death of the firstborn sons, which affects the Egyptians, but not the Israelites. It kind of ticks the Egyptians off, and not only does Pharaoh let the Israelites go, he kicks them out of Egypt. So as they're leaving Egypt, Pharaoh they killed the firstborn sons of all the Egyptians. Pharaoh is a little bit ticked off at these guys, and they look like they're lost out in the desert. So he sends his army out after them. They're going to take care of this problem once and for all. God, of course, is protecting the Israelites. So you see the story of the Red Sea, where God parts the Red Sea as the Egyptian army is coming after the Israelites cross over the Red Sea on dry ground. The Egyptians say, well, if those slaves can cross over on dry ground, we can too, and they take in after them. But God says, no, my people have made it across. It's time to close the sea up, and no more Egyptians chasing down the Israelites. So they're on the other side of the Red Sea. They're on the Sinai Peninsula at this point, and they spend about 1 million people, or over 1 million people, plus all their goats and sheep and cattle and old folks and young toddlers, and it takes them about 3 months to make it down to the Mount Sinai. So they get down to the base of Mount Sinai, and you probably have heard this story too. Moses goes up on Mount Sinai and he receives the 10 Commandments. But he receives more than the 10 Commandments. God downloads into him the design for the tabernacle, for the Ark of the Covenant, for the furnishings of the tabernacle. He downloads the priesthood to him and religious rites that are Israel is to follow, the sacrifices, the feasts, and he downloads civic regulations to Moses. He basically gives the Israelites a national identity. And they stayed at the base of Mount Sinai for about a year, making the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant and establishing the priesthood and putting together everything that God had downloaded to Moses. So then they take off, and they're ready to enter into the Promised Land. So they go from the Sinai Peninsula up to Israel, or to the southern edge of Israel. Israel is in a northeast direction from where they were. So they come up to the southwest edge of the Promised Land, which is the Gaza area. Now it's the same Gaza Strip that Israel is having troubles with over there right now. It's in the southwest corner of Israel, and when they get there, they stop, and Moses sends in 12 spies. He says, go on in, check the land out, see what's good, what's not, where the cities are, how tough they are, check things out. So the 12 spies go into Israel, and they spend 40 days in there, and they come back out of Israel, and they say, oh, that land is good land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. And two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, say, it's great, let's go in and get it. But the other 10 spies say, no, we can't. We can't go in and get it because there's giants in there. There's big people in there. The cities are strong and fortified, and we're not strong enough to take it. We can't do it. Well, the million people of the Israelites are listening to all this, and they follow the 10 spies' recommendations. They say, well, we can't go in. What are we going to do now? And God says, well, I'm telling you to go in. You won't go in. I won't let you go in. And God sends them back into the wilderness to on a long camping trip, to wander around in the wilderness, in the desert, for 40 years. And for 40 years, a whole generation of people who grew up as slaves in Egypt and would not trust the Lord to give them what he promised them, died off. They died off in the wilderness. Those who were 20 years or younger when they came out of Egypt have now grown up. They've become of age. Some would have spent 20 years as slaves in Egypt, but have spent the last 40 years developing a godly mental disposition. And finally God says, while you're wandering around, let's wander around to the east side of Egypt. And they wander around to the east side of Egypt, go east side of Israel. And they go on up, and they get into some battles, and they conquer the people who are on the east side of the Dead Sea, the Jordan River, the Sea of Galilee. Moses, who has brought them through all this time, dies on the east side of the Jordan. He's not allowed to go into the west side. He passes the mantle of leadership on to Joshua, who takes it up. The Jordan River parts in the same way that the Red Sea parted for Moses. The Jordan River parts. The flow stops upstream. And the whole Israelite community, or most of the Israelite community, is allowed to pass over the Jordan, which was at flood stage at the time. And they are on the other side on the west side of the Jordan at this point. And you're probably familiar with the first battle that takes place. It's the Battle of Jericho, where God supernaturally collapses the walls of Jericho, and a city that was too tough, too hard for them to take, they take in a matter of days. Then the battle is on. They do a whole southern campaign where they capture cities and territories to the south of where they came in. They do a whole northern campaign where they capture cities and territories to the north of where they came in. And there's a 7-year campaign that Joshua leads on the other side of the Jordan. And then the Bible says he gave them rest. They were told when they entered the promised land to get rid of all the inhabitants that were in the promised land. Get rid of them all, every man, woman, and child, whether they ran away or whether they got killed. Get rid of them all, because in the people on that land was an ungodly, idolatrous, evil spirit. And the need was to cleanse the land of that spirit so that the Israelites could have a godly government, a godly nation. After the 7-year campaign, that didn't happen. They had the center of the area cleared out, if you will. And it was enough so that they could settle down into some civic life, but they were still to keep the pressure on and to press out and push out the inhabitants that were there. But it didn't happen. They began to settle in their towns, they began to settle in their farms, their territories, and the inhabitants that were there began to intermingle and do business with and marry into the Israelite community, and the Israelite community began to do the same into the Canaanite community. And actually this happens after Joshua dies. He leads the campaign into the promised land. Age gets to everybody, he dies. So after he dies, there's a commingling of the two more than one nation that they were evicting from the area. And there's a commingling of the two peoples, of the godly and the ungodly. And this commingling leads to a moral failure in the Israelite community. And the moral failure leads to a failure in their national identity, and they decline. And as they decline, the other nations that are stronger and more powerful than they are able to come in and oppress the Israelites. When they get oppressed enough, they call out for help from God, and God raises up for them judges. Now, I know we're going to think about judges as being men sitting in black robes with gavels in their hands at a big desk and making judgments, and in part that's what they did, but they were also more leaders. You could almost think of the word judges in the Bible as leaders. They would lead military campaigns, they would judge cases, and they were godly people who could hear from God and lead the people in that. Keep in mind, it is now a mixed community. There are people who are very God-fearing. There are people who now have turned to Baal worship and idolatry. And there are people in between who are like, yeah, we can worship God, and maybe we can mess around on the side doing some ungodly things, and it all seems well. But you can't. So at any rate, the people would found themselves in a cycle. There's about 12 judges in the book of Judges, and they found themselves in a cycle where they get into a moral decline, they are oppressed, they call out to God for help, he sends a judge, the judge comes, they clean out the oppression, the oppressors who are coming after them, and they're taking place in different spots of Israel. But he pushes out the oppressors, and all is well. And because all is well, people kind of revert back to how they were, and their moral declines some more, and then they're oppressed, and then they call out, and this up and down cycle just continues, like I say, about 12 different times. And they finally get tired of it, and they say, you know what, we need to put an end to this cycle, we need a king. And so they call out for a king, and that's what we're going to discuss on our next episode of a Bible Primer. So join me next time when we talk about the monarchy.